Welcome back into the locker room. I'm your host, Will Kronsberg, joined this week by my guest, Kendall Smith. And today, Kendall, we are going to talk about college football. We're already a third of the way through the season, which seems crazy to think about. But what surprises, good and bad, have you seen this early in the season?
Well, Will, I cannot believe that we are already a third of the way through the season. I feel like the season just started and now it's like close to being halfway done, which is absolutely unbelievable. But I think if you want to talk about surprises, we have to start with the bad first, right? Give me the bad first and then give me the good. And obviously, being in the state of South Carolina, we could not go without mentioning the Clemson Tigers. They're ranked 25th now after their loss this past weekend to NC State. And gosh, it's surprising. They've been a playoff team over the last several years, and you'd expect Dabo Swinney's team to always be on top of things. But this year, they're just not looking the same, Will, and it's really, really shocking because, like I said, they've always been one of those consistent teams like in Alabama that's been up there in the top of the rankings year after year. And this year, they just don't seem to have it.
Well, you look at the playoffs the past few years. In fact, the whole history of the playoffs, you're talking about the same 4 or 5 teams. The Alabama, Clemson, Oklahoma, and Ohio State. And now Ohio State has a loss. Clemson has 2 losses. Oklahoma's had some close calls. Alabama's had some close calls. So who is left? What teams have been good this year?
Well, I think if you're going to talk about the college football playoff, you have to talk about the Southeastern Conference, and obviously that brings up Alabama. That brings up Ole Miss as a potential playoff contender. Obviously, the Georgia Bulldogs ranked number 2 in the country. I think you have a couple of teams in the SEC that are pretty much set for the college football playoff. This weekend, a huge matchup coming up between Ole Miss and Alabama, so that will certainly be interesting on the road in Tuscaloosa for the Rebels, and SEC Nation will be there as well. So huge matchup this weekend, but I think when you talk about the teams that are pretty much a given for the playoffs, you're definitely going to see 2 SEC teams. Other teams you can talk about, potentially Oregon, maybe Penn State, Iowa ranked number 5 right now. They're also in contention as well. So it's all up in the air at the moment, but I think the SEC is pretty much a given per usual.
Well, you talk about the SEC making college football playoff, but they seem to max out at about 2 teams, and that's because they all have to play each other. Alabama's already beaten Florida. Now Alabama's on a collision course with Ole Miss and Florida and Georgia play in a few weeks, and then ultimately probably either one of those 2 sets will play in the SEC championship, and we'll be down to only 1 or 2 teams that actually have 0 or 1 losses. So who fills in? Who's the best of the rest outside of the SEC?
Gosh, that's a good question, Will. And like I just mentioned, those teams, Oregon, Penn State, Iowa, also another SEC team that is definitely a playoff contender at this point, Arkansas. They are taking on Georgia this weekend, so that will certainly be an interesting matchup. But those 4 teams for me are kind of the ones that really, really stick out in terms of those other teams at the moment that are most likely to be those contenders for the college football playoff. But it's definitely going to be interesting. In this season, we have already seen 25 total ranked teams lose so far. We saw 6 ranked teams lose over this past weekend, so anything can happen, and I think 2021 is really proving that.
Well, we talk about ranked teams losing. Clemson's lost twice, like I mentioned, and now they've kind of been surpassed. They fell out of the top 10 for the first time in years. They're not even the highest ranked team in the state of South Carolina.
Coastal Carolina fans, stand up. They are definitely excited about that one.
Well, that's what I have to say. Last year we talked about some of these group of 5 teams. Could they make the playoffs? And then over the summer we talked about maybe expansion. That might be the only way. But Coastal and Cincinnati might be back in the conversation. What do you think?
They might be back in the conversation, and another team that's also looking pretty darn good is BYU. Now, they had a little bit of a slip-up this weekend against South Florida. Halftime coming back in was a little bit close of a call for BYU. But you mentioned those group of 5 teams, and it's so true. It may be the year for Cincinnati. It may be the year for a team like BYU. You just never know, and I think it would be great to see a group of 5 team in the college football playoff. I've had this argument for years. Do you expand the college football playoff beyond 4 teams? Because when it's 4, it's pretty much been proven at this point that a group of 5 team will never make it just due to the scheduling and how they don't have the strength of schedule that Power 5 teams have. But if you were to expand it, you never know it could happen. Maybe you could see a group of 5 teams slip in, but even in the 4 spot this year, it might happen.
Well, that's another game to look out for this year is coming up, Cincinnati playing a playoff team from last year, Notre Dame. So I think those matchups where the group of 5 teams get to play the bigger boys, we didn't see as much of it last year because of COVID, but now it's kind of back, and we'll see. Maybe they will really rise to the top, and before expansion can even happen, we might get our first group of 5 team in the playoff. But Kendall, I'm going to shift over to some individuals and talk about the top individual performers, Heisman favorites at this point in the season.
Yeah, so I think the Heisman favorite comes down to 2 names. You've obviously got Matt Corral out of Ole Miss and then Bryce Young out of Alabama. And this weekend is definitely going to be telling as to which of those 2 quarterbacks is in the lead for Heisman. Right now, I think Corral has been the favorite just by maybe a trace, by a tinge. They talked about it on SEC Nation held here at the University of South Carolina last week. Jordan Rodgers was all gung-ho. He was all in on Matt Corral. And at this point, I'm rocking with him too. I think he's the favorite. But anything could happen this weekend with the Alabama-Ole Miss game, especially it being in Tuscaloosa. So I think Bryce Young really has that opportunity this weekend to kind of get that edge. I know you mentioned, maybe just as a joke a little bit earlier, but Jalen Foster with South Carolina, you're like, hey, he might be in the conversation. No,
well,
I'm just kidding.
I mean, Jalen Foster is really he's been performing way beyond anybody's expectations, but having a wide receiver win the Heisman last year was kind of rare on its own. So a defender, especially on a 2-2 team, seems a little bit more unlikely.
I think we're set for a quarterback to win this year. Wide receiver winning last year was already like a shock of the century. So I think they'll stick to the tried and true this year quarterback, and I really do think it's between Young and Corral.
I mean, I agree. It has to come down to Young Corral at this point in the season. And Alabama's had quarterbacks. They weren't known for it, but now the past few years, they've had a lot of really good quarterbacks who have been Heisman finalists, but none of them have won it. Mac Jones finished behind his own receiver, Devontae Smith. Tua got second a few years ago. And you favor Corral on the Lane train, but will we ever see an Alabama quarterback under Saban actually win it, or they continue to just sort of be behind the scenes?
I think the real question is, will we ever see an assistant from Nick Saban's past beat him as a head coach on the opposing team? I think that's the real question. We could see that this weekend with Lane Kiffin. But to answer your question, Will, I do think we will see an Alabama quarterback at one point. And like I said, it could be Bryce Young's year. But I mentioned that assistant situation with Nick Saban. He's never been beaten by one of his former assistants when they were a head coach for the opposing team that Alabama played. And this year, I mean, it certainly could happen. Alabama has some really, really tough opponents during conference play with head coaches that are former assistants of Nick Saban. So I'm putting the money down. If I were a betting gal, I'd say this year is the year that Nick Saban, he goes down with that record.
Well, we know he has a huge coaching tree around college football, but like you mentioned, Lane Kiffin, sort of chief among them. He's the architect of the modern Alabama offense.
I think the real question is, who has the best Twitter, Will? Is it Lane Kiffin? Is it Shane Beamer? I was just like favoriting a ton of Lane Kiffin's tweets before we started filming this episode. He's hilarious on Twitter.
Well, when you think about Shane Beamer on social media, you have to think about his reaction to the Georgia game last week. Went viral. Maybe not his own posts, but it was something he said, and it got out there on social media. So it's definitely worth something. But alongside Lane Kiffin, I just want to mention another Alabama assistant who could beat him. Kirby Smart always has to be in the conversation. Georgia looks dominant. They're a top 2 team. They actually got a couple first place votes this week. So tying into it, final predictions for now. Playoff teams come the end of the season.
Oh my gosh, Will, you're killing me. This is a hard question. So if I've got to go with it, I'm rocking with Alabama, Georgia, Oregon, and Iowa.
Iowa coming in out of the Big Ten, not Ohio State anymore, no Big 12 or Pac-12 representation.
That's who I'm going with right now. I mean, we're only going into week 5, so again, this could totally shift by the time we get around to week 9, week 10, but that's where I'm at right now. What about you?
Well, they all 4 of your teams already have big wins this early in the season, so I agree with the first 3, but I think Oklahoma will come back. Because they play that Big 12 schedule, they don't have any actual losses on their ledger, despite some close games against Tulane and West Virginia. So I think Oklahoma will come back. They'll end up blowing out some teams with that Big 12 offense, and in the end, they'll sneak in, especially because I think Big 10 teams will start to devour each other. But that'll do it for us this week on The Locker Room. For Kendall Smith, I'm Will Kronsberg. Thank you so much for watching.